Welcome back to my desk, family. Today, we're stepping into a topic where religion, politics, morality, and global conflict all collide at the same intersection. Over the past several years, public tension between Donald Trump and leaders within the Catholic Church, including statements from the Pope regarding war, peace, nationalism, immigration, and diplomacy, has sparked ongoing debate about the role religion should play in political affairs, especially concerning conflict in the Middle East and tensions involving Iran. And it raises a larger question that continues to haunt modern society. Does the separation of church and state actually exist, or has it always been more complicated than we admit? One of the biggest misconceptions in modern culture is this idea that churches should remain silent on political or global matters. But historically, that has never been true. The church has always spoken out about war, about peace, about justice, government, power, human dignity. From the earliest days of Christianity, spiritual leaders addressed empires, kings, rulers, and military violence. In fact, many of the prophets in Scripture were deeply political voices, not partisan voices, but moral voices. They challenged systems, they confronted leaders, they warned nations. And throughout history, popes, pastors, theologians, and faith leaders have weighed in during moments of war because war is not just political, it's also moral. This tension that we're seeing now is something that I really want to address. Now, deepening on where someone stands politically, they may view comments from the Pope as necessary for moral guidance, or some people might view it as religious interference in state affairs. And that tension becomes especially sharp when conversations involve military actions or international conflict. Some political leaders argue that strength and force are necessary for national security. Meanwhile, voices within the church often emphasize diplomacy, restraint, humanitarian concern, and the sacredness of life. And here's the reality. Those two perspectives frequently collide. I want to slow down for a moment, and I want us to reflect critically. Because there are three points that I want to point out today for this moment that I really want us to consider with this conflict between President Trump and the Catholic Church. The first thing is that war is never only political. When governments discuss war, the language often becomes more strategic. They're talking about targets, operations, retaliation, defense systems, national interest. But religious voices tend to ask different questions. Questions like, who will suffer? Who will die? What happens to families? What happens to children? What happens to the soul of a nation? That's why the church historically speaks on war. Not because it controls governments, but because it speaks to the moral consequences of human decisions. And whether someone is Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, or otherwise, these are questions every society must wrestle with. The second thing I want us to consider is that separation of church and state may not mean what we think. Let's delve into this. This is where the conversation gets a little uncomfortable. Many people say church and state should be separate. But what does that actually mean? Historically, the principle was designed to prevent two things: government-controlled religion and religion-controlled government. But it was never meant to remove moral influence from public life altogether. Because the truth is, every government operates from some moral framework. The real question is not whether morality is the issue. The real question is whose morality shapes the conversation. And throughout history, religious institutions have always influenced laws. They've always influenced justice movements. They've always influenced wars, civil rights, education, and public ethics. So perhaps the separation of church and state is not a wall. Maybe it's more of a tension, a negotiation, a constant push and pull between power and conscience. The last thing I want us to consider, and then I'm going to let you go, is that political loyalty can sometimes silence moral reflection. One of the dangers of modern political culture is that people can become so loyal to personalities, parties, or ideologies that they stop wrestling morally with difficult issues. And war should always be wrestled with morally. Always. Not emotionally, not performatively, not tribally, morally. Because once society stops questioning violence, conflict becomes easier to justify. And this is where faith communities often play an important role. They force us to pause and ask deeper questions. Not questions like, can we do this? But questions like, should we do this? There is a historical reality to this. Let's be honest. Religion and government have never truly existed in completely separate lanes. Throughout history, kings sought approval from religious leaders. Governments used religious language. Churches shaped national identity, and faith influenced public policy. Even in America, political speeches are filled with references to God and prayer and faith and divine guidance. Presidents end speeches with sayings like, God bless America. Courtrooms use sacred texts for oaths. Our currency even says, in God we trust. So the relationship between church and state has always been layered, complicated, and deeply intertwined. As people of thought, as people of faith, as people of reflection, we must be careful not to reduce every global issue into political teams. Because war is not a sporting event. Real people suffer. Real families grieve. Real communities are destroyed. And sometimes the loudest voices calling for peace are religious voices, because faith traditions often remind us that every human life carries dignity. So I have some questions for you. I want to leave you with this. If governments shape policy through power and churches shape people through morality, can church and state ever truly be separated? Or have they always existed in conversation with one another? I want us to sit with that. Thank you for joining me today at my desk for another conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe religious leaders should speak publicly about war and political conflict, or should faith remain completely private inside of these types of situations and seasons? Let's continue the conversation. Until next time, I want you all to stay thoughtful, stay grounded, and above all, stay discerning. I'm Dr. Dandridge. Thank you for your time and for joining me at my desk. We'll talk soon.